like Miranda find a new wondrous world. Like who? Oh, what wonder! If any goodly creature there be, how beauteous mankind is. How lovely and fair, and are you married to her?
Am I what?
Married. Thus joined, let two souls be as one. You understand? Forever. Hear the words they speak mean that, forever.
What? No.
A brave new world. There's such people in it.
And so it's kind of tongue-in-cheek in a way, because he's naive to what is really awaiting to him. And when he gets there and sees like how disgusted they are by the idea of monogamy, or the idea, even the words mother and father are like profanities, and not even so much censored, but just everyone is so programmed to despise the idea of family in any way. That was kind of one of the most horrifying parts of it, I think, compared to right now. Like how much closer we are getting to that on a cultural, societal level, without even being this far into a technocratic superstate or whatever. It was amazing. But he's kind of being paraded around by his kind of sponsor, Bernard, who's kind of like letting him be used as an experiment and everything. But John Savage just becomes disillusioned and disgusted by everything he sees. And so by the end of it, he just wants to go be left alone by himself. He doesn't want to go to some exiled island with all the other free thinkers, because he's just so sick of all of it. And even then, he can't be left alone, because they secretly film him and make a little documentary, and so people from New London keep coming out to like gawk at him and all this stuff. And it causes a riot, which they put down with Soma, and a bunch of people die. And the book and the movie do not have quite the same ending. They kind of changed it a little bit to be more of a Romeo and Juliet kind of thing, where he finds her after the Soma and thinks that she's dead, but she's not. And so he goes and hangs himself, and then she gets taken off and reprogrammed or killed or whatever. So it's definitely a tragic ending that kind of leaves you going like, why did I just spend three hours watching this? And but that was kind of the whole takeaway. It was like, okay, so this is the big. When you put this all back into the broader context again of the arc, not just of these writers, but of the arc that we as kind of like the mass of society have followed, as all these things have now kind of played out in the real world, all the attempts of enforcing these scientific dictatorships and, different versions of socialism and centralized government and automation and technocracy and all these things, communism, by whatever other name. Huxley himself writes this piece, and it does feel very like he's genuinely repelled by a lot of these consequential horrors that he sees, which H.G. Wells, would never even explore, right? And so he continued to kind of grapple with this up until his death, and he wrote A Brave New World Revisited, which has an extremely interesting foreword. A new foreword that said, "If I were now to rewrite the book, I would offer the Savage a third alternative. Between the utopian and the primitive horns of his dilemma would lie the possibility of sanity. In this community, economics would be decentralist and Henry Georgian. Politics, Kropotkinesque and cooperative. Science and technology would be used as though, like the Sabbath, they had been made for man, not, as at present and still more so in the Brave New World, as though man were to be adapted and enslaved to them. Religion would be the conscience and intelligent pursuit of man's final end, the unitive knowledge of immanent Tao or Logos, the transcendent Godhead or Brahman, and the prevailing philosophy of life would be a kind of higher utilitarianism, in which the greatest happiness principle would be secondary to the final end principle. The first question to be asked and answered in every contingency of life being, how will this thought or action contribute to or interfere with the achievement, by me and the greatest number of other individuals, of man's final end?" And I thought that was absolutely fascinating, because indeed, that's a great question. What are we doing? What does that final end mean? And again, that's where if you go back to what is your starting point for that question, if you're still within the paradigm of, a cosmos that just created itself out of nothing somehow through an explosion, and there's Darwinian self-assembly of life and order out of chaos, evolution essentially is order out of chaos. It's more than just a dialectic kind of social engineering device. It's literally what you believe everything is. But, he starts turning to spirituality and drugs and psychedelics, and he writes The Doors of Perception. But in 1958, he's still concerned about overpopulation and all these things. So he's, unsatisfied, wanting, there's got to be more. There's got to be an answer. There's got to be a third way, a third alternative. And the idea of a community where, it's decentralized and, science and technology is to be used as being made for man and not man for, like the Sabbath. I mean, hopefully you can understand why, that is going to make sense to a lot of people. And this is why Huxley is very interesting and unique in this whole conversation, because he kind of marks really the path that so many people end up taking when they come face to face. They wake up from, whatever their soma was or whatever their path was, and you kind of see that, hey, this whole Brave New World thing, this New World Order thing isn't just some dumb conspiracy or something in a bunch of science fiction books, but it's actually, these are the writings of these children of scientism for a long, long time, right? All these little pupils of scientism and humanism, right? Which is kind of fascinating, going back to the whole idea of Shakespeare being the furthest thing back. That's the whole concept of spirituality and soul and poetry and, all these things that we feel like are just kind of being squeezed out of modern society and modern life more and more all the time, and the sanctity of the individual is just being crushed and drained and commodified and all this. So it kind of represents, you turning back to this vague yearning for history and art and the humanities, whatever. But if it never goes back to God, it's all just as empty and just as kind of nihilistic in the end. But Huxley's last book that he wrote before he died in 1963 was just called Island, published in 62. And so he essentially writes out a story that he described there in that foreword of some guy going to an island, which is a very common theme in all these utopian books, going back to Bacon's New Atlantis and such. Or even Thomas More's Utopia, which was published 100 years before New Atlantis, which is fascinating in itself. But written by Thomas More, who was kind of a pre-Jesuit, but published posthumously after his execution by Erasmus. But in some ways, the main character of Utopia, Thomas More's Utopia, resembles John Savage in Brave New World, ironically enough. It was self-flagellation and, whipping yourself and all this stuff. Very strange. But in Island, 1962, basically, it's about a guy, he goes to this community, this decentralized community where technology is used, but it's all in balance, and people have more time for leisure, and they have all this freedom, and it's kind of going back to what H.G. Wells describes in his very first kind of utopian novel in 1923, titled Men Like Gods, where there was no world government, but essentially the government was just the education of everyone and the enlightenment of everyone. And so it kind of involves just a bunch of discussions about, monistic spirituality, and there's an ayahuasca type drug experience, and then they wake up and the totalitarian country next door is basically about to take them over. And so it kind of ends with just as much of a hopeless question as Brave New World did, and then Huxley's gone. And so, after thinking about all this stuff for the last few weeks, even, it's amazing how many parallels just kept jumping out at me each day after watching this. Especially now where the whole right-left paradigms are just getting more and more ratcheted up. This culture war and over issues that are very real issues, and it's not. And I'm not trying to sidestep any of them to just say, oh, it's all part of this dialectic. So being pro-life doesn't matter, and caring about your country or caring about, what's actually happening in the world where you live, whether it's economically or that. These things absolutely matter. But at the end of the day, if you don't actually have a hope that it goes beyond the hope of this character, if there is no creator behind not just our existence, but if there's no redeemer for what has befallen the human race, namely sin, and there is no resurrection of the dead to where, you actually have eternity with Christ, where sin can no longer be allowed to exist. And it really is all the things that fallen men have tried to imagine about creating a utopia and creating the ideal society can never do anything but just create a dystopia. That's kind of the whole takeaway, I think, is what history shows us again and again, is that no matter what we try and do, the reality of sin just takes over and creates a nightmare of one kind or another. Creates all manner of distortion. All manner of just inventing ways to do evil. And so ultimately, I kind of came away going, there's two falsehoods that this movie represents. I mean, in a very emotionally connective way, but I would say it's the feeling of hopelessness that because there is no God allowed into the equation, and John is alone. He's alone throughout the whole thing, and that feeling of isolation and being the only one who, see. That's what I think is most compelling about this whole story, is you really kind of see the world through John Savage's eyes, and either you get it, you either relate to that by walking around in the world that you live in, or you don't. You probably think it's really, really dumb story. But ultimately, Aldous Huxley just turned to the same thing that so many people today are turning to in their yearning for something deeper and yearning for a hope that goes beyond just what consumerism can bring them, or just constant sexual indulgence can bring them, or, material prosperity or whatever, having achieved, whatever measure of success in society you hope to achieve. And it's a very painful process of waking up to a world that has already incorporated so many of these ills and these evils and these eugenics-based ideologies and methodologies, and especially now that technology has now reached such a stage where at least the media is debating if AI could be sentient. And for the record, I don't believe that AI will ever become sentient. But I'm just fascinated by the fact that they're talking about it. This Google engineer just is making all the rounds. He was on Tucker and all these places, and they're having this silly conversation about this AI bot who's supposedly like an 8-year-old child, and it's just getting weird. Elon Musk is visiting the Pope, and he's being painted as like the family guy now. Elon Musk is like pro-family. Nothing tops the reality that we live in terms of just the scope of insanity and, clown worldiness. The brave new clown world just keeps breaking new ground in various ways. But that feeling of being alone and isolated is one of the hardest parts of it, for sure. Even when you come to the place where you're entertaining the idea of there being a God,